Okay, hi everyone, welcome back. Today we will have our second in this semester and 13th in the series Inverse Seminar. For those who is your first time to join, Inverse Seminar is a weekly seminar series dedicated for early career researchers in mobility and energy field that to present research, refine ideas, and to build a community. Today, we are very excited to have Michael. Some of you may have seen him a couple of times in previous seminars. Michael is a PhD candidate at UC Berkeley in the Department of City and Regional Planning and a researcher with California Pass. Before that, he did his undergrad in Harvard University and his master's program in Columbia University. So Mike's work focuses on the intersection of emerging transportation technologies, sustainability, network infrastructures, and urban planning and policy. And today, he will kind of like a demonstration or practice of his job talk presentation. The title is Autonomy in Flux. And welcome, Mike.
Thank you, Yi. Hello, everyone. It's great to be here today. So I didn't know I was the 13th. I'm lucky number 13 in the series. So the format of the eMERGE series is basically that of job talks. Today, I'm going to present what is essentially a modified version of a job talk I gave at the University of Texas at Dallas 2 weeks ago for an assistant professor in planning and policy position in their School of Economic, Policy, and Political Sciences. Before I start, I must note that this talk is unique in a few ways for the eMERGE series. The first is that I am not an engineer. I am a city planner specializing in transportation technology with a background in economics and in university administration of all things. The second reason this talk is unique is that the job at UT Dallas is intended to support new degree programs in sustainability planning. UT Dallas does not currently have a planning department or planning degree programs. Moreover, they do not have transportation researchers in any department except for a pair of professors working on battery management systems in their Department of Computer Sciences. The advertised position is for the first professor in planning in the school's history, and the search committee is made up of geographers and political scientists. I should point out that they do not have a civil engineering department either. As such, I had two primary goals for this talk.
Maybe it's better to switch to your voice.
Yeah,
unmute your.
Okay, can people hear me?
Good.
Okay. 1 second for feedback. Good to go? Okay, excellent. As such, I had two primary goals for this talk. The first was to present myself, my transportation scholarship, my lecturing style, my passion for an academic career, and to showcase how my administrative experience could support the sustainability planning and policy programs. The second goal was to highlight to geographers and political scientists how transportation is a fundamental component of sustainability studies. I'm going to begin my presentation by talking about that second point for a few slides before going into a discussion of the work I presented in Dallas and how I envision my contributions to that university. Sustainability is often discussed as resting upon three pillars: an environmental pillar, an economic pillar, and a social pillar. The environmental pillar represents management of resources and the environment, as well as adapting and mitigating the effects of climate change, including the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. The economic pillar represents the development of markets, goods, and services that allow for growth and high social utility, and the advancement of practices and policies that accurately price the use of scarce resources. And the final pillar is social sustainability, which signifies access to basic needs and opportunities, improvements to people's quality of life, and the fostering of community connections and political engagement. There is, of course, considerable overlap between pillars, but I find this conceptualization of sustainability to be a useful framework to discuss transportation, because transportation impacts the stability of each of these pillars and has an important role to play in buttressing sustainability in each of these regards.
When considering environmental sustainability, I must note that transportation is one of the leading, if not the leading source of greenhouse gas emissions. About a quarter of all emissions worldwide are related to transportation, and about a third within the United States. For the majority of Americans, car travel is the principal source of greenhouse gas emissions, and per passenger mile, driving as a vehicle's sole occupant releases more carbon dioxide equivalents than taking a commercial flight. Transportation is also deeply embedded into economic sustainability. Nearly 7% of economic activity within the United States can be credited to transportation, and about 10% of American workers work in transportation. Transportation contributes in intense ways to the US and global economies, but it is also a huge expense for many people. It is the second largest household expense in the United States after housing, and nearly all household transportation costs are related to auto travel. Unfortunately, my pointer doesn't work on the screen, but I just want to highlight just that small sliver at the bottom. It represents all non-automotive travel costs. One reason why auto travel is the principal component of household transportation costs in the United States is that it is relatively cheap. We have one of the lowest average petroleum and diesel tax burdens in the world. And despite its proliferation of toll roads, or despite our proliferation of toll roads, we don't price the use of roadways and other automotive infrastructures accurately to account for the social and environmental costs of their use. Conversely, many argue that we actually do the opposite, that we subsidize the use of cars over other forms of travel. Probably the most impactful voice in advancing this argument was Donald Shoup, who showed through dozens of empirical studies that American cities vastly underprice the provision of parking. The core of his argument is that there is no such thing as free parking or free road use, and that the costs of free use of auto infrastructures are bundled into higher prices for goods, the opportunity costs of using land for parking and highways, and supporting auto infrastructures through taxes not directly tied to auto use. Shoup's points also speak to how transportation affects social sustainability. By subsidizing the cost of auto travel, we have made cars the principal means people access opportunities. About 80% of Americans access work by car, and over 90% drive to access healthcare. As an aside, we used to see similar numbers for access to education as well, but that changed dramatically after COVID, and now only about 50% of Americans use cars to access schools. These points are critical because accessibility defines people's quality of life. And by relying on cars to provide access, we, one, exclude people who cannot drive or afford to purchase and maintain cars from many aspects of social life, and two, shape many societal and cultural practices around automobiles. Some, including historians Ken Jackson and Peter Norton, go as far as to claim that depending on automobiles weakens communities, particularly poorer, urban, and township communities, degrades societal connections, and leads to geographies that marginalize all other forms of travel.
I'm curious how people in Texas reacted to all this so far, but
well, you're at a great point for this, because now I'm actually going to speak to how planning responds. So how does the planning profession and policy traditionally address transportation sustainability? As you've probably noticed, I've talked a lot about cars so far. This has been intentional, very much so, because in simple terms, the ways planning addresses transportation sustainability can be summarized as cars are bad. And given their environmental impacts, economic dynamics, and societal ramifications, this is a wholly understandable approach to take. Thus, to advance transportation sustainability, planners typically try to encourage non-automotive modes of travel through improvements to transit, active transportation infrastructure, and construction of dense mixed-use developments, or by discouraging auto use through pricing mechanisms like tolls, congestion charges, or higher parking rates. These are all worthwhile approaches that can be successful sustainability initiatives in many contexts. But to truly plan for sustainability, I argue that we must identify how car use itself can become more sustainable. The simple fact of the matter is that despite its environmental impacts and costs, most Americans drive, and a growing proportion of people worldwide rely on auto use. To plan for transportation systems with sustainability in mind, we must recognize the popularity of cars and look to emerging automotive technologies as potential means to reduce emissions and decrease reliance on private vehicle ownership. Luckily, automobility is changing, and in more than one way. A few years ago, Dan Sperling from UC Davis organized an anthology book on how the smartphone, electric vehicles, and autonomous vehicles are changing urban travel. He called these technologies three revolutions because of their impact they could potentially have on the environment, the economy, and society. He is ultimately optimistic about their potentials, particularly if used in tandem to shift auto use away from fossil fuels and reliance on private vehicle ownership. But he acknowledges that the outcomes of these technologies depend on how they are used and how we plan infrastructures around them. Following the work of Dan Sperling and others, including Robert Cervero, Susan Shaheen, and Eric Guerra, my core research interest is investigating the societal ramifications of emerging technologies as potential enablers of more sustainable transportation systems. I mostly, but not wholly, focus on automotive technologies because of the impact auto use has had on cities, the climate, and society. I've structured my research agenda around researching ride-hailing, electric vehicles, and autonomous vehicles because of their synergistic potentials to affect sustainability goals and because of uncertainties regarding how best to plan for such outcomes. Specifically, I investigate app-based ride-hailing's capacity to reduce private vehicle use and ownership across urban geographies. I assess how the deployment of electric vehicle chargers and changes to EV policies enable individual actors, commercial fleets, and governments to adopt EVs. And I question how the location and characteristics of existing transportation infrastructures affect autonomous vehicle operations and how AV use may change travel costs and urban form. So for the rest of this presentation, I'm going to first present some of my research on how public chargers relate to EV adoption in urban areas. Then I will briefly discuss some recent projects and my research agenda going forward. I will then talk about my teaching portfolio and record of academic service, although I'm going to kind of breeze through that because this is not a real job talk, before closing with my summary of experiences and excitement for the role that I presented at UT Dallas. So let's begin. Electric vehicles paired with continued decarbonization of electricity generation could significantly reduce the environmental impacts of automobile use. Electric vehicles are growing in popularity, but their use is predicated on the ability to charge them. Unlike internal combustion and compression engines vehicles, refueling an EV can take hours. Because of the time it takes to recharge, most EV owners charge at home, often overnight, and only rely on public chargers for longer trips or if there's or to top off their batteries if a convenient charger is located to a common destination like their workplace. While such charging paradigms have proven convenient for many users, they overlook the fact that many drivers living in multifamily housing or in dense urban areas do not have a dedicated place to park at home and charge. As such, these people typically forego EV adoption, even if they would otherwise be inclined to purchase an EV. This current research project is essentially about how public chargers relate to EV adoption in cities. Right now, in the United States, most public chargers are level 2 chargers. I know most of the people attending the eMERGE talks know about charger levels and charger speeds, but the audience I was presenting to at UT Dallas did not. So I took some time to explain that. I'm going to skip through most of this slide. I would just like you to note that of the research I'm going to present, I make a distinction between level 2 and level 3 public chargers because they really do provide a very different end user experience. A growing number of researchers have recognized how the existing paradigm of at-home and destination charging excludes urban residents and people living in multifamily housing from adopting an EV. My favorite description of this issue comes from Lawrence Ulrich at the New York Times, who called it the Great Disconnect. Because when polled, most urban drivers express optimism about EVs. They want to adopt them. They are less susceptible to the range anxieties of suburban commuters because they have shorter daily trips. They are often more excited about new technologies and more aware of climate change. They want to adopt EVs, but they don't have a dedicated place to park at home. They don't have a place to charge, and as such, they don't switch to an EV. The irony of this situation is magnified by the fact that cities are typically places where EV chargers cluster, but not near where people live. They cluster near destinations where EV charger companies have greater access to a larger market of EV drivers. But those drivers are mostly commuters coming from less central areas. Cities have become aware of this issue, and in recent years, many cities, counties, and states have amended parking minimum policies and taken other planning or policy actions to direct charger installations within urban neighborhoods. For example, in Chicago, the city now requires parking facilities in new multifamily housing units be charger ready, typically meaning that a 240-volt supply is available near where residents park. In Marin County here in California, eligible owners of multifamily housing units receive up to $4,500 per charger port installed on their property. And in Massachusetts, National Grid, an energy provider, in partnership with the state, will cover up to 100% of the cost of charger installations in housing with 4 or more units. And with that in mind, I started this project drafting 2 working questions. First, does expanding public charger availability in dense urban areas with limited dedicated residential parking relate to higher EV adoption rates? And do city-led planning or policy efforts to direct charger construction in urban residential neighborhoods contribute to changes in EV adoption within the communities where chargers are installed? Well, previous research suggests that having a place to charge at or near one's home is a strong predictor of EV adoption. Researchers often identified as the strongest predictor of EV adoption, alongside the availability of purchasing subsidies. Previous research also suggests that faster public chargers, in other words, level 3 DC fast chargers, relate to stronger adoption rates, and charger availability in denser areas relate to higher adoption rates as well. But nearly all these findings come from studies looking at the state or national scale. While most of the evidence is supportive of public chargers' potentials to encourage EV adoption, some researchers, including German economist Patrick Joachim, suggest avoiding the placement of EV chargers in urban neighborhoods because they believe that if urban drivers really do want to switch to an EV, they could amend their travel habits to charge at destinations like shopping or at work. In response, Ishra Malabanan and others from the University of Melbourne and University College London recognize that urban EV drivers do indeed go out of their way to, and sometimes vastly change their daily habits to charge. And they contend that these actions represent additional costs for urban EV users that they call a charging dissidence, discouraging adoption. As always, there's some notable shortcomings to the existing research. Most existing research on how public chargers relate to EV adoption overlooks the US context. Few studies focus on urban areas as unique geographies, and until now, no study has controlled for planning efforts directing charger installations in urban neighborhoods. For the current project, I intend to contribute to the literature a perspective that overcomes these shortcomings. In New York City, the most noteworthy city-led action directing charger installations in urban neighborhoods is the Plug NYC program. Plug NYC is essentially a collaboration between the city, Con Edison, the utility company, and Flow, an EV charger company, to install curbside, higher power level 2 chargers in urban residential neighborhoods. About 50% of New York City drivers park on the street near their homes as a form of residential parking. And the city wanted to direct charger installations to these areas because they believed that a spatial mismatch existed between where chargers in the city are located and where urban drivers live. The result of the first wave of charger installations in 2021 and 2022 was 100 new chargers spread across 35 sites located outside of Midtown and Lower Manhattan, where existing chargers already clustered. And the Plug NYC chargers look something like this. An interesting outcome of the planning process that led to charger installations is that many Plug NYC chargers are not located within residential neighborhoods themselves, but adjacent to them. Some residents and community groups expressed worry over dedicating residential parking for EV charging. So in many cases, the city decided to locate Plug NYC chargers at metered parking spots near shopping areas immediately adjacent to or at the end of residential streets. Aware of the Plug NYC program, I began to seek the most comprehensive data possible on EV adoption and charger availability in New York. I submitted a Freedom of Information request to the New York Department of Motor Vehicles for every vehicle registration over the last 10 years, and they responded with providing me access to the registration data for the last 5 years because they purge records after 5 years. The data from 2020 was incomplete, likely due to COVID, so I was only able to access comprehensive records for 2021 to 2024, and I ended up scoping the study to 2021 to 2023 because of the availability of other data sources. New York vehicle registrations list the fuel type of battery electric vehicles as electric. So using the registration data, I am able to calculate EV registration rates across the state. I accessed public charger data from the Department of Energy's Alternative Fuel Data Center, which provides day-specific records of the location and characteristics of EV chargers. And I accessed American Community Survey data for demographic variables, which I ended up using as controls in my analysis. With this data in hand, I slightly amended my research question. My first question remains the same. Does expanding public charger availability in dense urban areas with limited dedicated residential parking relate to higher EV adoption rates? but I've now tailored my second question to focus on the Plug NYC program. Did the Plug NYC program contribute to changes in EV adoption within the communities where the program installed chargers? To answer these questions, I built a panel regression model at the modified zip code tabulation area level, using EV registration rates as the outcome variable and the number of chargers by type normalized by population, and a categorical variable indicating areas exposed to the Plug NYC program as the independent variables of interest. I built the panel of data using 3-month quarters, starting with January to March 2021 as quarter 1, and October to December 2023 as the final quarter, quarter 12. I aggregated data to the modified zip code tabulation area level because the DMV anonymizes the registration data to only include the zip codes and registered mailing addresses. And zip codes, while relatively precise spatial indicators, are somewhat problematic in New York. And that is because zip codes are not zip code tabulation areas. Zip codes are a routing number used by the post office to get mail to where it needs to go. It alone is not a geography. On the other hand, zip code tabulation areas are a geography produced by the US Census Bureau, associating census data to the geographic scope or approximate geographic scope represented by a zip code. Now, zip code tabulation areas represent zip codes very well nearly everywhere in the country. And this is true in New York as well, except for the fact that New York has more special purpose zip codes than anywhere else. Special purpose zip codes are often assigned to hospitals or university campuses, but in New York, there are also buildings with their own zip codes, like the Empire State Building and the Chrysler Building, that do not have a zip code tabulation area, but do have vehicle registrations or EV chargers. Because of these limitations and the availability of zip code level data, the New York City Department of Health developed modified zip code tabulation areas to track COVID rates in 2020 by dissolving smaller zip codes into larger ones and using what's known as a proportional split to account for the modifiable aerial unit problem. But their analytical goals were different than mine. I am not interested in the spatial proximity to COVID infections, but to the density of EV registrations and chargers. As such, I developed my own modified zip code tabulation areas with the goal of retaining as many of the original zip code tabulation areas as possible. To give you an example of how I modified tabulation areas, I'm going to zoom into Lower Manhattan because here you can see the possible outcomes of the modification process in close proximity to each other. Basically, my approach was to retain a tabulation area if it has census population data whenever possible. Many of the zip code tabulation areas in the city represent 1 or 2 buildings, and they lack a population. So in these cases, I associated the zip code registration and charger data to the encompassing zip code and dissolved the smaller tabulation area geography into the encompassing tabulation area. One example of this outcome is 55 Water Street, a building with its own zip code, but no tabulation area or census data. Interestingly, it has vehicle registrations, actually quite a few vehicle registrations. So I dissolved it into a larger tabulation area surrounding it. Also, fun fact, this is the largest building in New York by floor area, and it is also home to the New York DOT. So it's quite relevant that it ends up becoming a particularly interesting point in my study. Another example of this outcome is the Equitable Life Building, which does have a tabulation area comprised of a single building, but that tabulation area has no census population data, so I again dissolved it into the encompassing tabulation area. And finally, we have the Woolworth Building, which has a tabulation area, it has registrations and census population data, so it was retained as a standalone tabulation area. One of the other small tabulation areas that was retained was 500 East 77th Street. I can't point to it, but it's like that small green dot kind of in the northeast corner of Manhattan. And I think what makes this building and the Woolworth Building stand out is that they are the only buildings with special purpose zip codes that are wholly residential. Some of the other buildings with their own zip codes have some residential units, but they are predominantly commercial or another use. Overall, most of the special purpose zip codes are located in Manhattan, where building density is the highest. In all, 182 modified tabulation areas were used in this study. I must note that I ended up excluding the zip codes covering the airports as well. which have very small populations due to homeless shelters and EV registrations and chargers, but these chargers are intended for people visiting the airport and are as such kind of outside the scope of this study. When looking at the quarterly registration data, there are a few important details to point out. First is that a small percentage of registrations, about 1.3%, had to be excluded due to errors or other issues in the registration records. Some registration records, like listing a New York City borough as the county, were missing zip codes or had impossible zip codes, like zip codes with 1 or 2 or 7 digits. And some registrations listing P.O. box zip codes could not be spatially located, so those were excluded as well. But in all, I was able to retain nearly 99% of registration records for New York City over the time frame of the study. The second thing to notice is the seasonal trends in registration rates, which I would be pointing to with my pointer. But people generally register new vehicles or re-register vehicles during spring or summer quarters. And we can see that trend in the data. The final thing to notice, and I am 100% burying the lead here, is the spike in EV registrations in the final quarter. The rate of EV registrations has been climbing over time, but it spikes in the final quarter of 2023. We go from on average 7,000 EV registrations per quarter in the prior years to 11,000 in the spring and summer of 2023 and to 25,000 in the autumn. Why is this the case? Well, the likely answer is that federal EV subsidies changed in January 2024, and fewer vehicles became eligible for the $7,000 tax credit for EV purchases. It looks like people were rushing to buy specific EVs before the subsidies changed. I do not answer the extent to which this change in subsidies contributed to the observed EV registration rates in this study, but I do control for changes over seasons and time in my regression analysis, and I have a follow-up study looking exactly at this question, which I will discuss later on. As for the charger data, we can see that the number of chargers steadily grew over time. In fact, there was about a 50% growth in the number of chargers over the 3 years of the study, and that there are over 10 times as many level 2 chargers in New York City compared to level 3. And this is where the chargers were located over the study period. I should note that this map is showing charger locations, and each location may be made up of level 2 or level 3 chargers, and each location may have more than one charger port. The point I'm trying to emphasize with this visual is that while we see charger expansion across the city, the vast majority of locations remain in Midtown and Lower Manhattan. Also, I should note that 27 tabulation areas received chargers for the first time during the course of the study. When compared to total vehicle registration rates, we can observe that there is indeed a spatial mismatch, say that 3 times fast, between where chargers are located and where New York drivers live. But there are more charger locations in areas with high vehicle registration rates at the end of the study period. As for differences between relative densities of level 2 and level 3 chargers, we can see that level 2 chargers cluster in Manhattan throughout the study period. But secondary clusters along the East River in Brooklyn and Queens grow. Also, small satellite clusters tend to develop over time. As for level 3 chargers, they tend to cluster near highways and other major roads, often near where highways intersect. Level 3 chargers more often serve longer distance drivers, and we can see that their location reflects this purpose. Level 3 chargers also do not cluster as densely as level 2 chargers, and existing clusters remain consistent. Now, when looking at the Plug NYC chargers, there are really 2 important points to mention. First, as I discussed before, the city purposely avoided locating chargers in Midtown and Lower Manhattan because of the existing density of chargers. Second is that in total, 29 tabulation areas received Plug NYC chargers, and of those 29, 5 did not already have a public EV charger. In other words, the Plug NYC program is responsible for the introduction of public EV chargers to 5 tabulation areas in the city. Finally, I must mention that the spatial distribution of EV registration rates changed dramatically in 2023. Looking at Q1 2021, we can see that higher EV registration rates are mostly found in Manhattan and along the East River in Queens and Brooklyn. But in the final quarter of 2023, higher EV registration rates are found elsewhere in the city. On first glance, this change implies that people living further away from the city center may have become more inclined to purchase EVs as time went on. But when looking at the data for all the quarters side by side, we notice that the spatial distribution of relative EV registration rates remains relatively consistent throughout each quarter, except for quarter 12. Again, this is likely due to changes in EV tax credit subsidies in January 2024. I must hold back from indicating that this is the case while discussing the current study, because the current study ends in 2023. But I can say that the data we are seeing from quarter 12 is highly noteworthy and commands further analysis. Now on to the actual regression analysis. While building my analytical model, I had three goals in mind. The first is obviously validity. I want my model to be accurate. The second was to use quarterly data on registrations and charger locations. And the third was interpretability. I wanted the results of my model to be relatively straightforward to report to planners and policymakers. Because of the distribution of my dependent variable, which is EV registration rates per 1,000 total registrations, I decided to use a model form often used in transportation economic research, which is the negative binomial model. The negative binomial model handles highly dispersed data well, and its coefficients can be reported as exponentiated incidence risk ratios, which ease in interpretation. I also decided to specify fixed effects for my panel regression to account for any observed spatial variations across tabulation areas. When testing different model constructions, I added independent variables progressively, starting with spatially defined public charger variables, followed by vehicle access variables, then other demographic variables, and finally the time variables. Years and seasons were included as temporal controls to account for the influence of unobserved annual effects and seasonal trends in registration rates. I ultimately decided on a model using the log likelihood method to judge the model's goodness of fit, which I confirmed using the Aki-Ike and Bayesian information criterion statistics. And here is the model output. To reiterate, the unit of analysis is 182 tabulation areas over the time frame of 12 quarters, and the panel is perfectly balanced. I should also point out that I confirmed the appropriateness of a fixed effects model over a similarly constructed random effects model using the Hausman specification test. There are a few things to highlight. First is that the model found a significant relationship at the 95% confidence level between the number of level 2 chargers by population and the EV registration rates by 1,000 total registrations. The model estimates that for an additional level 2 charger per 1,000 residents, holding other variables constant, the number of EV registrations per 1,000 total registration climbs by 15% above the mean of 14.7 EVs. Rescaling this result to the actual EV registration rate, the model suggests that for the first additional level 2 charger per 1,000 residents, the tabulation area EV registration rate climbs from 1.47% to 1.69%. This is not a trivial projected effect. Looking at the modeled relationship between median household income and EV registration rate, we can estimate that the projected effect of an additional charger per 1,000 residents is about the same as $40,000 of additional tabulation area median household income. Previous research found that income relates to higher EV registration rates, and my results provide insight into how impactful public charger installations may be at encouraging EV adoption in urban areas relative to income. Interestingly, unlike previous research which found a stronger relationship between level 3 chargers and EV registration rates compared to level 2 chargers, level 3 chargers by population failed to produce a significant association in my model. I have two possible explanations for this outcome based on previous literature. First is that there are too few level 3 chargers in New York to have a meaningful effect on EV registrations. The total number of level 3 chargers in the city is about 1/10 the number of level 2 chargers. The other explanation I have, and this is the explanation I prefer, is that level 3 chargers are not located near where people live in the city and are thusly not being used primarily by city residents, but by commuters and longer distance drivers. As we saw earlier, level 3 chargers tend to cluster near highways and not in urban neighborhoods. If I were to aggregate my findings to the state level, as had been done in previous studies. The number of level 3 chargers may have produced a significant result showing a relationship with higher EV registration rates. But when focusing on urban geographies, as I have done, we do not see such a result. Finally, I also find that the plug NYC variables did not produce a significant result as well. Again, this may be due to the relative lack of plug NYC chargers in the city compared to level 2 chargers overall, or due to their placement often adjacent to residential areas as opposed to within, which may encourage higher EV registration rates overall, but not in the immediate area. I would also like to highlight the magnitude and significance of the time variables, which suggests that an unobserved effect across time was a more impactful influence on EV adoption. Again, this may be related to the change in federal EV tax credits that came into effect immediately after the time frame of the study. So back to my original questions. What did I find? First is that at the tabulation area level, level 2 chargers by population relates to higher EV registration rates for drivers living in tabulation areas, corresponding to about a 15% increase above the mean EV registration rate for an additional level 2 charger per 1,000 residents. However, I did not find any indication that the Plug NYC program contributed to higher rates of EV adoption in tabulation areas included in the Plug NYC pilot. Overall, my findings suggest that installing level 2 chargers in dense urban residential areas likely encourages or enables drivers living nearby to adopt EVs. This study is the first examining how the availability of level 2 chargers relates to EV adoption to focus on dense urban areas and to focus specifically on an American urban area where dedicated at-home residential parking is not the norm. It's also the first to consider the potential effects of planning efforts to direct charger installations into residential neighborhoods. Unlike previous studies looking at larger geographies, the number of level 3 chargers did not produce a significant result, but overall, my findings support claims that installing chargers near where urban residents live will accelerate EV adoption. But finally, there's one last point here, which is that I need to check if people are actually replacing legacy vehicles with EVs or simply adding EVs to the vehicle stock. This is why this ethos or motivation is why I used EV registration rates as the dependent variable, as opposed to simply the number of EVs in each tabulation area. But it is possible that EV registration rates climb alongside the total number of vehicle registrations by population. As such, I am adding one final question to the study. Are there any indications that expanding EV charger availability relates to higher vehicle ownership rates near charger locations in urban areas? To answer this question, I am currently modeling, earlier today, I was writing some code for this. I will model total vehicle registrations per 1,000 residents as the outcome variable and report the results alongside the findings I discussed earlier. I will complete this analysis in the coming weeks while finishing a manuscript for publication. I will then submit the completed paper to the Journal of Transport Geography in February and present at the American Association of Geographers Conference in March, which is in San Francisco this year. So I made a joke to all the geographers at UT Dallas to make sure to stop by Berkeley when they're in town in March. Finally, the sharp increase in EV registrations near the end of 2023 needs to be examined. So I will undertake a follow-up project looking at the changes in federal EV purchasing subsidies in early 2024 related to meaningful changes in EV purchases. EV registration rates have been growing over the last decade, and I wonder if the spike in EV registrations in 2023 is followed by a significant decline below the established trend, or if this spike actually corresponds to significant growth in EV purchases over time. It may be possible that constricting the number of eligible EVs led to higher net EV adoption. And in the follow-up project, I intend to find out if this was indeed the case. So that is the core of this talk. I still have like 5 more minutes. So I'm going to just quickly go through some of the other elements of my job talk. The whole eMERGE series is kind of built around sharing each other's job talk. So I'm just going to go over the other things that I discussed really quickly. So at this point, I discussed how most of my research focuses on EVs and the spatial planning of chargers, but that I have other research projects in process and a broader research program that goes beyond private adoption of EVs. So over the next few slides, I discussed my research agenda and briefly talked about a few other examples of my ongoing work. So when I'm asked to summarize my research, I typically respond by saying that I investigate technology and how technology impacts cities and communities, and the ways we plan settlements in place with the goal of assessing ways to enable people, firms, and governments to use more sustainable forms of transportation. As such, most of my research looks at cars and automotive technologies, but my research goes beyond just cars. I recently started a project with Professor Mei-Ching Lee at the University of Central Florida, looking at how Brightline high-speed rail station development in Florida relates to land use changes and changes in economic activity. Brightline is fascinating because while high-speed rail is not really a new technology, it is a technology that is highly underutilized in the United States. And also, Brightline was the first private railroad to offer services in the United States for over 60 years. When they launched, they took the lead in designing their own stations, and they claimed that the construction would lead to denser, more sustainable developments in the surrounding areas and stimulate economic activity. I'm also originally from Florida, and I think high-speed rail may have the potential to anchor more sustainable forms of travel, but Mei-Ching and I are not sure that all the Brightline stations will meet this promise. As for future plans, in the next 2 years, I plan on expanding my research into autonomous vehicles by assessing how street design and the geography of urban transportation infrastructure relates to AV pickups, drop-offs, collisions, and disengagements, and by assessing how AV travel could contribute to changes in travel costs, commuting behaviors, and urban densities. Finally, within the next 5 years, I intend on researching how EVs and AVs interact with electricity and computational infrastructures. EVs' potentials to reduce greenhouse gas emissions lies at their intersection with the electrical grid. For EVs to advance sustainability goals, energy generation will need to continue decarbonizing, but EVs and other societal changes are increasing energy demands. For example, AV operations rely on cloud-based machine learning, which itself represents a huge energy demand. I wonder how governments, energy providers, and AV operators and EV users are responding and planning the future of electrical and computational infrastructures in light of growing energy demands and the interactional nature of AV and EV development. One of my other ongoing EV projects looks at how government agencies are incorporating EVs into their fleet. About a year ago, I received a grant from the California Partners for Advanced Transportation Technologies, or PATH, the best transportation research center in the nation, to investigate how Caltrans, which is the California Department of Transportation, directs EV procurement and charger installations. Caltrans has been uniquely successful at incorporating EVs into their fleet. They are the largest state DOT, and about 25% of their light-duty vehicles have been electrified. After early discussions with Caltrans officials, my research assistant, Mary Basica, and I were able to secure access to Caltrans Telematics API. For those who don't know, telematics is essentially like a real-time record of where all Caltrans 10,000 on-road motor vehicles are operating, what their vehicle characteristics are, and if they are refueling or recharging, how much time it took them to refuel, and how much fuel or energy was transferred. This project started out as a mixed methods project, looking at how facility characteristics relate to EV integration. But after receiving access to the telematics, the scope of the project changed and expanded because we noticed trends in EV charging habits that defied the findings of previous research. Namely, Caltrans EVs are often reliant on public chargers and in some cases, residential chargers at employees' homes. Previous research using surveys had found that public fleets rely primarily on fleet chargers, but we found that in some places of the state, that is simply not the case. Inspired by these preliminary findings, we decided to split this project into 2 sub-projects. The first sub-project is more of a qualitative project where we are or a quantitative project where we are developing a taxonomy of fleet charging events, such as maintenance charging, range extension charging, by evaluating the comprehensive records provided into telematics using spatial statistics, network analysis, and clustering methods. For the second sub-project, I've been taking more of a qualitative approach built on interviews and institutional ethnography to understand how Caltrans makes EV procurement and charger installation decisions. I've spoke about this project quite a bit over the last few months with many of the people in attendance today, so I'm going to hold back on going through it for today's presentation. Just know that I gave a brief overview here during my job talk in Dallas. Also know that I gave a brief overview of a paper that I recently published actually looking at ride-hailing and how ride-hailing relates to changes in vehicle use and ownership across Boston. And the thing that really stands out about this project is that while previous studies had used surveys or aggregate measures of vehicle use, like congestion, we were able to access every vehicle inspection in Massachusetts over a 5-year time frame as Uber was introduced to Boston. And Uber was introduced in a very spatially defined way across the city. So we were actually able to directly assess changes in vehicle use and vehicle ownership as Uber rolled out in the data of 1.7 million vehicles. So we think we have the best data possible on exploring this topic. And whereas previous studies had shown a 20 to 80% increase in VMT, we found a 0.6% increase in VMT related to Uber introduction. And this has been also supported by the findings of other emerging papers based out of Georgia Tech. So we think that previous studies were failing to account for the demise of the taxi industry, really, when making their VMT estimates. So that recently was published. Please come talk with me if you're interested in ride hailing. So what else did I do when I gave my job talk? I talked about my teaching resume. I talked about the courses that I would teach at UT Dallas, including some of their existing courses and some future courses that I'd actually written syllabi for. So when I was talking with them in interviews, I was able to say, hey, I have these syllabi for courses I would like to teach. And then I really highlighted my academic service because this was something that the search committee had said was one of the reasons why they were interested in me, because they're starting these planning degree programs. If I were to go there, I'd be the first professor in planning there. They needed someone with some administrative and grant writing background. This is where I would do a summary of everything I talked about. And that is it for today. I want to thank you all for joining me. I want to thank Yi again for organizing. I think this has been an amazing series to see a broad range of different job talks that transportation PhDs are asked to compile. And I also think it's just been a lot of fun. So thanks again. And are there any questions?
Thank you, Mike. So let's start from any question from the audience. Any question?
I can't see Zoom. So if there are any
Yeah.
questions on Zoom, please let me know.
Yeah, people on Zoom, if you want to ask a question, feel free to. I think you can unmute yourself. Yeah. If you don't mind, we can also switch to this one.
Oh.
I suppose it will. Yeah.
Okay, so I will turn off my audio.
That will be great.
See that Scott asked me a question.
Oh, over Slack?
Over Slack.
It wasn't yeah, I guess it was a question, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
So Scott asked, do you think the spike in EV registrations in Q4 2023, which is Q12 in my study, is due to the NYC Green Rise Initiative going into effect? It may have an impact, but I do not believe it did. I think what we're really witnessing here is the rush to purchase vehicles before the federal subsidies changed. And the slide that I discussed this on, Zoom is in my way. Let me go back to that slide real quick. So this was a slide that I was using to discuss this point. I originally had a different image here, which was an image of Elon Musk touting how incredible Q4 2023 was. It was the best quarter in Tesla history. And that was true for pretty much all EV companies, all EV manufacturers. And what was happening was basically some Build American programs were going into effect, which stated that the critical components of your battery, basically lithium, had to be sourced from, or not sourced from certain countries. And a certain percentage of the other battery components had to be made in America, and that your vehicle the final assembly had to take place in the United States to be eligible for the EV tax credits. And it basically shrunk the number of eligible EVs by about a third. So what I think is happening is that people were rushing out to go and purchase EVs before the subsidy changed. And we can see this if we were to extend this graph out into 2024, we can actually see it return back to a lower rate after 2024 or after quarter 12. The thing that I'm questioning now is that is this spike, the net effect of this spike, representative of a overall greater EV purchases over time, or if this will regress back to the mean and we will see lower EV registrations over the next few quarters, and this is just an anomaly due to the change in the EV registration rates. Because from an economic perspective, there's actually like a history of more restrictive policies leading to higher sales for something, and people rush to access a subsidy or rush to try and mitigate their costs in some ways before the policy changes. So while I think more local programs like the Green Rides Initiative may have had some effects, I think overall that the change in subsidies probably had a stronger effect, particularly considering since previous research has shown that subsidies have a very strong relationship with EV registration rates. Some literature actually suggests that it's the subsidies that are more impactful than access to chargers at home. That's actually an ongoing debate right now in the literature.
Maybe let me ask some question a little bit technical because
Yes.
I've been interested in this question also for a while. I think the broader question is people often say causality versus correlation.
Yeah.
And I think for this EV ownership versus accessibility to public chargers, I can name some specific concerns, say reverse causation, also confounders or confounding variables, and also for time series panel regression, I think it not necessarily to be the number of chargers at the current time period, but maybe 2 time periods ago that matters more. All these concerns, I just would like to hear how you deal with these concerns. Do you run some sensitivity analysis? And even a specific sensitivity analysis, I think is, have you ever run a sensitivity analysis to exclude the last quarter? Because it's obviously abnormal compared with previous quarters. Yeah. So sorry, these questions are, I think, quite technical, but I really appreciate the broad picture you have shared with us.
These are great points. So with regards to causality, this project actually originated as a difference in difference analysis, which is one of the reasons why I was identifying the zip code tabulation areas that received charges for the first time. And while building the difference in difference model, we came across a few problems, which is that first is that we couldn't satisfy the demands of difference in difference analysis. The other is that over the last few years, more criticism has been given to difference in difference models that are cross time, that are panel difference in difference models, particularly when the treatment effect is not temporally uniform. And so some weighted difference in difference models have been suggested, but it is an issue that we do not believe we can satisfy given the limitations of the data that we do have access to. I can't remember your middle point, but to get back to the causality issue, this project is predominantly descriptive. We are seeing, what we're looking at is we are looking at how EV registration relates to the availability of chargers, but it is a model built upon I should have shown it, a directed acyclic graph. We are trying to identify and control for the variables that we do believe would impact EV registration rates beyond just the availability of chargers. And it's something that is furthermore controlled for by the fixed effects nature of the panel regression. So even the variables that we are not controlling for spatially, we are accounting for, even though we cannot directly estimate their effect with the reliance on fixed effects. As for temporal lag, this was actually something that someone brought up at UT Dallas as well. And I have considered removing quarter 12, but I think it's so noteworthy that it should be included. And also it is the unobserved temporal effects are being controlled for through the temporal fixed effects, through the seasonal variables and through the year variables. So again, while we cannot control for, or we cannot provide a reliable estimate for each individual thing that's changing over time, we are controlling for them in the regression model, and we can see that they are having an outsized impact on the EV registration rates. What was your middle point again?
I think I mentioned confounding factors, confounding variables.
So directionality, it was another thing that you mentioned as well. And the I think, again, this is being partially controlled for by the construction of the model with the variables that we have included. But as of right now, there's no guaranteed way to say, is the location of chargers determining EV registrations, or is EV registrations determining the location of chargers? However, I will say that with the Plug NYC program, there's a very different motivation behind those charger constructions, those charger locations. Historically, EV charger locations, particularly in urban areas, are guided by market forces. They want to access the charger companies want to access a broad market. And we see this in interviews and surveys with EV charging companies. The Plug NYC program was specifically geared towards putting chargers into or near residential areas. It was a very different motivation, and the motivation was to enable people who live there or live nearby to adopt chargers, or sorry, to adopt EVs. That being said, it doesn't nullify the concerns of causality, the directionality of causality, but it is an important point to make. Thank you.
Yes. Question. You just mentioned that in your experimental result, you find that a YC program has no significant results of the increasing of penetration rate of EV. So it is due to this panel regression. And my curious is that if we use causal inference, if you use the counterfactual the counterfactual analysis, maybe when you assume this program is not implemented, what the future will be, and compared to what it is like today, is that more makes sense?
Yeah, so I actually see this often in the ride-hailing research. So I talked about the Georgia Tech study. The way they estimated that was they built a counterfactual model for Atlanta to estimate the changes in VMT if Uber would not be present. I tend to not rely on simulation modeling. My approach really is to find comprehensive data, the best quality data, and to look at what's represented within the data. But what you propose is a very interesting alternative method that I think should be advanced, but I don't think it's something that I would necessarily advance myself.
Because that will involve human behavior modeling, I think, in another scenario.
It would involve, but also typically you're building counterfactual models on data from somewhere else that's similar. And what other places are as similar to New York? This is one of the issues for when doing research in New York, is that there's, particularly in the US context, there's not that many other US cities that are representative of, or are similar in the ways that we are interested in. Limited at-home parking, dense development, high transit usage. Typically when you see counterfactual models for New York, it's built on data from Boston or Philadelphia, sometimes Chicago. But it's a difficult city to create a counterfactual model for, as you suggest. In the example of the Atlanta case, they were able to use, I think it was Chattanooga, and some other nearby cities that did not receive Uber until years after Atlanta had received ride hailing, to source data to build their counterfactual model.
Thank you.
I have just one question in chat. Oh, it's not a question.
Yeah, is there any other question? If no, we are going to conclude here, and I do not want to, I don't like to say that, but yeah, seems people are quite busy the first month of the semester, so we will have a break until March 2nd. And we will have our next year speaker. I will keep you updated via our mailing list. Thank you again for coming. See you.